It was a cold, crisp morning when Emily stepped out of the hospital after her night shift. The streets were just beginning to wake, the air filled with the distant hum of traffic and the occasional chatter of early commuters. She pulled her coat tighter around her, exhaustion weighing heavily on her shoulders. All she wanted was to get home, sink into her bed, and let the world fade away for a few hours. But fate had other plans. As she walked down the quiet street, a sudden commotion caught her attention. A few people were gathered near a small park bench, their voices tinged with concern. Emily's instincts kicked in before her brain could catch up. She hurried over, her heart pounding. That's when she saw her. An elderly woman lay motionless on the pavement, her grey hair spread across the ground like silver threads. Her frail body looked so still, so fragile, that for a brief moment, fear gripped Emily's chest. Without hesitation, she dropped to her knees beside the woman, her fingers searching for a pulse. She just collapsed, a man said, his voice shaky. I think she fainted. Emily nodded, quickly assessing the situation. The woman's breathing was shallow, her skin cold to the touch, but her pulse was there, weak but steady. Relief flooded through Emily, but she knew this wasn't over yet. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" she said gently, tapping the woman's hand. There was no response. A few seconds passed, stretching into what felt like an eternity, and then the woman's eyelids fluttered. A soft groan escaped her lips as she struggled to open her eyes. "It's okay," Emily reassured her, keeping her voice calm and soothing. "You fainted, but you're safe now. Can you tell me your name?" The woman's lips parted, but her voice was barely a whisper. Emily leaned in closer, catching a faint trembling sound. Margaret. I'm Emily. I'm a nurse. Can you tell me if you feel any pain?" Margaret's gaze flickered with confusion, her eyes darting around as if trying to piece together where she was. Her fingers twitched, gripping the fabric of her worn-out coat. "Dizzy," she murmured. Emily gave her a reassuring nod. "All right, just take slow breaths. We'll get you some help." She turned to the bystanders. "Someone call an ambulance." A woman fumbled for her phone, quickly dialing. As they waited, Emily continued monitoring Margaret, holding her hand as she slowly regained more awareness. It was only then that Emily noticed how thin she was. Her hands bony, her cheeks sunken. The coat she wore looked several sizes too big, its fabric worn and frayed. "Do you have any family we can call?" Emily asked softly. Margaret hesitated, her cloudy eyes filling with something unspoken. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, "No one." Something in her tone made Emily's chest tighten, a kind of loneliness that went beyond words. But before she could ask anything more, the sound of an approaching siren broke the moment. The ambulance pulled up, and 2 paramedics stepped out, quickly taking over. Emily watched as they carefully lifted Margaret onto the stretcher, strapping her in securely. "Are you coming with us?" one of the paramedics asked, noticing the way Emily was still holding Margaret's hand. For a second, Emily hesitated. She had just finished a grueling night shift. She was supposed to be on her way home, to finally get some rest. But as she looked down at Margaret's frail fingers, still lightly clutching hers, something inside her wouldn't let her walk away. "I'll come," she said, surprising even herself. Margaret turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting Emily's. And in that moment, Emily saw something else: gratitude, relief, and something deeper, something Emily didn't understand just yet. As the ambulance doors closed behind them and they sped toward the hospital, Emily had no idea that this one decision would change everything. that this one act of kindness would uncover secrets buried for decades, alter the course of Margaret's life and her own. The ambulance ride was quiet, aside from the steady beep of the monitor and the occasional rustling of supplies. Emily sat next to Margaret, watching her carefully. The elderly woman's eyes remained half closed, her breathing slow but steady. Every few minutes, she would shift slightly, as if trying to fight off the dizziness that still clung to her. "Do you remember what happened before you fainted?" Emily asked gently. Margaret blinked a few times, her gaze distant. "I was walking," she murmured. "Felt lightheaded, but I thought I'd be fine." Emily nodded. It wasn't uncommon for elderly patients to underestimate their symptoms. Many didn't want to be a burden, or simply ignored the warning signs. But something about Margaret made Emily feel like there was more to the story. When they arrived at the hospital, the paramedics helped Margaret onto a bed in the emergency room. Doctors and nurses moved swiftly, checking her vitals and setting up an IV. Emily knew she should leave now, that her shift had ended hours ago, but her feet remained rooted to the floor. As Margaret lay there, her hands trembling slightly, she turned her head toward Emily. "Stay, please," she whispered. That one word hit Emily harder than she expected. Stay. How many times had she heard that word from her own patients? From people who were scared, alone, unsure of what would happen next. But there was something different about the way Margaret said it. It wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, a plea. Emily nodded. "I'm here." Hours passed, and Margaret slowly started to regain her strength. The doctors confirmed she was dehydrated and malnourished, and her blood sugar had dropped dangerously low. When they asked if she had been eating properly, Margaret simply looked away, avoiding the question. That didn't sit right with Emily. And when she caught sight of Margaret's coat, thin, patched up, clearly meant for someone struggling to get by, an uneasy feeling settled in her stomach. "Margaret," Emily said softly, sitting beside her. "Do you have a place to stay?" The old woman hesitated, her fingers gripping the hospital blanket. Then, after a long pause, she let out a shaky breath. "I had an apartment, but I lost it a few months ago. Rent went up. Couldn't keep up." Emily's heart clenched. "You've been living on the streets?" Margaret gave a small nod, as if admitting it out loud made it even more real. Emily felt a lump form in her throat. She had seen homeless patients before, people who had lost everything, who struggled to get by day after day. But hearing Margaret say it, seeing the exhaustion in her eyes, made it feel different. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Emily asked gently. Margaret let out a bitter chuckle. "Who would I tell? I don't have anyone." The words stung. No family, no friends. Just an old woman, navigating a world that had moved on without her. Emily exhaled slowly. She wasn't sure what she had expected, but the weight of Margaret's loneliness settled deep in her chest. "Do you have any children? Relatives?" Emily asked, hoping to find someone who could help. Margaret's face darkened. She looked away, her jaw tightening. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then, in a voice so soft, Emily almost didn't hear it, she whispered, "I had a daughter." Emily straightened. "Had?" Margaret's eyes filled with something unreadable. "We lost touch. A long time ago." The way she said it, so full of pain, regret, made Emily's stomach twist. But before she could ask more, a nurse walked in with Margaret's discharge papers. "You're free to go," the nurse said kindly. "Do you have somewhere safe to stay?" Margaret hesitated. "She can come with me," Emily said before she could think twice. Both Margaret and the nurse turned to her in surprise. "I mean, just for the night." Emily added quickly. She needs rest, and I don't feel right letting her leave with nowhere to go. Margaret looked at her, eyes full of emotions Emily couldn't quite place. You don't have to do that, Margaret murmured. I know, Emily said, but I want to. And so, a few hours later, they stood outside Emily's apartment. The night was cold, the wind biting against their skin. Margaret clutched her coat around her thin frame, looking hesitant. Emily unlocked the door and stepped. Inside, flicking on the light, her place was small but warm. The scent of coffee and lavender lingering in the air. She had never had a guest before, let alone someone she had just met. But as she watched Margaret step inside, looking around as if she were in a completely different world, Emily knew she had made the right choice. Margaret sat down on the couch, her hands resting on her lap. She looked exhausted, but there was something else too, a quiet sadness. Emily sat across from her. Do you want to talk about your daughter? Margaret looked up, her eyes glistening. For a moment, Emily thought she wouldn't answer. Then with a deep, shaky breath, Margaret spoke. I made a mistake, she whispered. A mistake I can never take back. Emily leaned in, her heart pounding. What happened? She asked. Margaret's lip trembled. I gave her up when she was just a baby. The words hung in the air like a ghost, heavy and full of years of pain. Emily felt her breath catch. Margaret clenched her hands together. I was young, alone. I thought I was doing what was best, but I regretted it every day since. Emily's chest tightened. She couldn't imagine carrying that kind of burden for a lifetime. Do you know where she is now? Emily asked gently. Margaret shook her head. I tried to find her, years ago, but I never could. She swallowed hard. I don't even know if she'd want to see me. A heavy silence filled the room. Emily's mind raced. There had to be a way to help, and then an idea struck her. What if we try again? Emily said softly. What if I help you find her? Margaret looked up sharply. Her eyes filled with both hope and fear. Do you really think we could? She whispered. Emily nodded. I don't know where this will lead, but I think it's worth trying. Margaret exhaled shakily, her fingers trembling against her lap. And in that moment, Emily knew this wasn't just about helping a stranger anymore. It was about something bigger, something that could change both of their lives forever. Margaret stared at Emily, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and fragile hope. It had been decades since she last searched for her daughter, and the thought of reopening that old wound terrified her. But there was something about Emily's kindness, her determination, that made Margaret believe, just for a moment, that maybe it wasn't too late. Over the next few days, Emily helped Margaret in every way she could. They searched online, digging through records, old directories, anything that might give them a lead. Margaret provided the only details she remembered: her daughter's birth name, the city where she was born, and the adoption agency that had handled everything. At first, it felt like an impossible task. Years had passed. Records were sealed. Some doors remained closed. But Emily refused to give up. She spent her breaks at work making calls, sending emails, and following up on every small lead. Then, one evening, Emily's phone buzzed with an email that made her breath hitch. She quickly opened it, scanning the words over and over, making sure she wasn't imagining things. Heart pounding, she turned to Margaret, who sat in the dimly lit living room, staring out the window. Margaret, Emily said, her voice trembling. I think I found her. Margaret froze. She turned slowly, her eyes wide, her hands gripping the armrest of the couch, as if steadying herself. What? She whispered. Emily swallowed hard. There's a woman. Her name is Sarah Lawson. She was adopted as a baby. The birth records match the details you gave me." She hesitated before adding, "I think she's your daughter." Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes, but she didn't say anything. She just sat there, breathing heavily, as if trying to process the weight of those words. "She lives just outside the city," Emily continued gently. "She runs a small bookstore." Margaret let out a shaky breath. "A bookstore," she murmured, almost to herself. Emily could see the battle happening inside her, the longing, the fear, the years of regret pressing down on her. "I don't know if she'll want to meet me," Margaret finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily reached for her hand. "There's only one way to find out." The next morning, they made their way to the bookstore. Margaret was silent during the drive, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. When they finally pulled up outside the cozy little shop, she let out a shaky breath. Emily gave her an encouraging smile. "Are you ready?" Margaret didn't answer right away. She just stared at the bookstore, as if trying to gather the courage to step inside. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she nodded. The bell above the door chimed as they entered. The air smelled of old books and fresh coffee. A woman stood behind the counter, stacking a few novels on a shelf. She looked to be in her early 50s, with warm brown eyes and a gentle presence. Margaret's breath caught. The woman turned and smiled politely. "Hi, welcome in. Let me know if you need any help." Margaret's lips parted, but no words came out. She looked frozen, her entire body trembling. Emily stepped forward. "Are you Sarah Lawson?" The woman frowned slightly. "Yes. Can I help you?" Emily glanced at Margaret, giving her a small nod. This was her moment. Margaret took a deep breath. "Sarah," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "It's me. It's your mother." Silence filled the air. Sarah's expression shifted from confusion to shock. Her eyes darted between Margaret and Emily, as if trying to piece together what she had just heard. "My mother," she repeated, her voice barely audible. Margaret nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I gave you up when you were just a baby," she whispered, "and I have regretted it every day since." Sarah's lips trembled. She looked as though she had just been hit by a wave of emotions she wasn't prepared for. "I don't understand," she whispered. Margaret swallowed hard. "I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted to see you, to know that you were okay, to tell you how sorry I am." Sarah stared at her for a long time. Emily could see the storm of emotions in her eyes. Pain, disbelief, anger, but also something softer. "I spent years wondering about you," Sarah finally said, her voice unsteady. "Wondering why you left, if you ever thought about me." Margaret's face crumpled. "I thought about you every single day." Sarah took a deep breath, as if trying to steady herself. "Why now? After all this time?" Margaret glanced at Emily, then back at Sarah. "Because I was too afraid before. And then one day, I fainted on the street, and this kind young woman saved me." She reached for Emily's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "She reminded me that it's never too late to try." Sarah looked at Emily then, as if seeing her for the first time. For a long moment, the bookstore was silent. Then, Sarah exhaled and took a small step forward. "I don't know how to feel about this," she admitted. "I don't know if I'm ready for whatever this is." Margaret nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I understand, but," Sarah continued, hesitating, "maybe we could start small." Margaret's breath hitched. "You mean, maybe we could talk," Sarah said. "Just talk. See where it goes." A sob escaped Margaret's lips, but it was a sound of relief, of hope. "I'd like that," she whispered. Sarah nodded, a small uncertain smile forming on her lips. And at that moment, Emily felt something shift. A connection that had been broken for decades was beginning to mend. Margaret had found the piece of her heart she had lost so many years ago. And Emily, though she had only meant to help a stranger, had somehow found something too, as they sat down at a small table in the bookstore, with steaming cups of tea in front of them. Emily realized that life had a strange way of bringing people together. Sometimes all it took was a single act of kindness to change everything.